Millionaire pretended to be blind for 3 years until he discovered his partner's secret. Richard Wilson clenched the document between his fingers as he listened to the hurried footsteps of his secretary fading down the hallway. For 3 years, he had kept the dark glasses on his face, feigning a blindness that never existed, and today he would finally find out if all that sacrifice had been worth it. It all started when he overheard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. Michael Thompson, his business partner of 20 years, was on the phone talking about speeding up the process and taking advantage of his situation. Richard had just returned from the restroom when he caught those words coming from his own office. He hid behind the slightly open door and kept listening. "No, we can't wait any longer. Richard is getting too suspicious. It needs to happen soon before he finds out anything," Michael said with an urgency Richard had never heard in his friend's voice before. Richard felt his heart race. Michael was plotting something against him. But what? And who was on the other end of the line? The questions pounded in his mind as he quietly slipped back to the restroom, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the bedroom ceiling, trying to make sense of what might be going on. Michael had been his best friend since college. The two of them had built the company from the ground up, working day and night to turn a small family construction business into one of the largest corporate groups in New York City. "Richard, are you okay?" asked Jennifer, his wife, turning over in bed. "You're tossing and turning." "I'm fine, love. Just thinking about the West Side project," he lied, not wanting to worry her without knowing for sure what was really happening. Jennifer sighed and went back to sleep, but Richard stayed awake until dawn. When he arrived at the office the next day, he decided to pay closer attention to the details. He began observing Michael more carefully, noticing small things that had previously escaped his notice. During a meeting about the new development in the Upper East Side, Richard noticed Michael avoided direct eye contact when discussing deadlines. His hands also trembled slightly as he signed documents, something that had never happened before. "Michael, are you sure about these numbers?" Richard asked, pointing to a spreadsheet. "The costs seem way higher than we initially calculated." "Oh yes. There were some last-minute adjustments. Technical issues, you know how it is," Michael replied quickly, shuffling the papers away. "But it's all under control." Richard wasn't convinced. After Michael left the room, he called the lead engineer on the project directly. The conversation left him even more uneasy. "Mr. Wilson, actually, the costs went down last week. We found a better steel supplier," the engineer explained. "Didn't Mr. Thompson mention that?" Richard hung up with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Michael was lying about the numbers, but why? And where was the extra money supposedly being spent going? Over the next few days, Richard began investigating discreetly. He asked Mrs. Barbara, his trusted secretary of 15 years, to review some old contracts. She was a 62-year-old woman, extremely efficient and loyal, who knew every detail of the company inside out. "Mrs. Barbara, could you take a look at the financial reports from the last 6 months? I want to check for any discrepancies," Richard requested, closing the office door. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. Is something wrong?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "I hope not, but I'd rather be sure," he replied, handing her a folder. While Mrs. Barbara worked, Richard continued his quiet investigation. He began noticing other strange details. Conversations that abruptly stopped when he approached, meetings he was forgotten from, and documents that vanished from his desk only to reappear days later in different places. The final straw came when he overheard a second phone call from Michael. This time, he was passing through the hallway when he heard his partner's voice coming from the conference room. "He can't find out. Understand? If Richard discovers the shell company, everything will fall apart," Michael said. "We've already transferred over 2 million. We just need a few more months." Richard stopped breathing. A shell company? 2 million? Was his best friend stealing from him? The betrayal hurt more than any punch to the gut. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. It was at that moment Richard had the idea that would change his life for the next 3 years. If Michael thought he could fool him, he'd uncover just how far this betrayal went. But he needed a plan, something that would let him observe everything without raising suspicion. Inspiration came unexpectedly. Over the weekend, while watching an old movie with Jennifer, he saw a scene where the protagonist faked a disability to uncover who was trying to kill him. The idea was absurd, but also brilliant. Richard spent all Sunday considering the possibility. If he pretended to lose his sight, people would let their guard down around him. Michael and any other conspirators would feel safer to act, thinking he couldn't see what they were doing. By Monday morning, Richard was determined. He arrived early at the office and asked Mrs. Barbara to come to his room. "Mrs. Barbara, I need to tell you something very important, and I'll need your help," he said seriously. "You're worrying me, Dr. Richard. Has something serious happened?" she asked, sitting in the chair across from his desk. Richard told her everything, the conversations he'd overheard, his suspicions about Michael, and the crazy plan he'd come up with. Mrs. Barbara listened in silence, her eyes widening as the story unfolded. "Dr. Richard, this is very dangerous. What if they find out?" she whispered, glancing at the door. "It's a risk I have to take, Mrs. Barbara. Michael is like a brother to me. If he's really betraying me, I need to know how far it goes and if others are involved," Richard explained. "You're the only person here I trust completely." Mrs. Barbara fell silent for several minutes, clearly processing everything she'd heard. Finally, she nodded. "If this is what you feel you must do, I'll help. But we have to be very careful," she said. "How will we do it?" Richard had already thought through the details. He would fake a home accident over the weekend, claim he fell down the stairs at home, hit his head, and suffered temporary vision loss that doctors couldn't fully explain. "Private doctors are discreet. We can convince a few to go along with the story," Richard explained, "and you'll help me seem convincing here at the office." Over the next week, Richard studied how blind people behaved. He watched documentaries, read articles, and even visited a center for the visually impaired under the guise of a company charity visit. He learned about the white cane, how blind people navigated familiar spaces, and the small details that would make his act more believable. He also began memorizing every inch of the office so he could move with the ease of someone who knew the space well. The accident happened on a Friday night. Richard called Michael from home, his voice shaky and clearly panicked. "Michael, I need help. I fell down the stairs and hit my head. Jennifer took me to the hospital, but I can't see properly," he said, carefully controlling his tone. "My God, Richard, I'm on my way right now," Michael replied, and Richard could hear genuine concern in his friend's voice. Maybe he had been wrong about Michael. Maybe he had misinterpreted the conversations he'd overheard. This doubt tormented him during the first days after the accident, when Michael showed constant care and worry. Richard spent 3 days in the hospital, wearing eye patches to keep up the charade. Jennifer was desperate and he hated lying to her too, but he couldn't risk anyone discovering the truth before he had the evidence he needed. "The doctors said it might be temporary," he lied to Jennifer, holding her hand. "The brain sometimes needs time to readjust after trauma." "But Richard, what if it doesn't come back? What about the company? Our life?" Jennifer wept, and every tear felt like a knife in Richard's heart. "We'll face it together, my love, like we always have," he said, secretly promising to reveal everything once he uncovered the truth. When Richard returned to the office the following week, wearing dark glasses and using a cane, people's reactions were exactly what he had expected. Mrs. Barbara played her part perfectly, guiding him through the halls and reading documents for him. Michael was by his side the whole time, offering help and showing concern. Richard began to feel guilty for suspecting his friend. Maybe he really had misheard those phone calls, but the illusion lasted only a few days. "Richard, maybe you should stay home a little longer. Rest," Michael suggested one Tuesday while they were in Richard's office. "I can handle things here for now." "No, Michael, I need to work. It helps me not think about the situation," Richard replied, noticing a subtle shift in his partner's tone. Of course, but maybe it's best if I sign some documents for you." "Just temporarily until you adjust better," Michael insisted. Richard felt a chill down his spine. This was exactly the kind of behavior he had expected if his suspicions were correct. Michael was trying to take more control of the company, using Richard's supposed blindness as an excuse. "That won't be necessary, Michael. Mrs. Barbara can help me with the documents. She knows my signature better than anyone," Richard said, keeping his voice calm. He couldn't see it, but he sensed the tension in the air. Michael stayed silent for a few seconds before responding. "Of course you're right. Mrs. Barbara is very efficient," he finally said, but Richard detected poorly concealed irritation in his voice. From that moment on, Richard began noticing changes in people's behavior, conversations that stopped when he approached, though he caught fragments, meetings happening without him, discussing matters he should have been part of. Mrs. Barbara became his eyes and ears. She discreetly reported everything she observed: who visited Michael, what documents he requested, and which phone calls he seemed to have most frequently. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Michael has been getting many calls from someone named Andrew," she reported one Thursday. "And yesterday he told me not to schedule anything for you on Friday, said it would be a quiet day." Richard knew Andrew. He was a lawyer specializing in mergers and acquisitions, someone you called when you wanted to buy or sell companies. Why would Michael be secretly talking to him? On Friday, Richard decided to stay in the office after hours. He told everyone he would wait for Jennifer to come pick him up, but in truth, he wanted to see what would happen when they thought he had left. He pretended to leave with Mrs. Barbara at 6 in the evening, but quietly returned an hour later, using the back entrance. He managed to reach his office unseen and stayed there in the dark, waiting. Around 8 in the evening, he heard voices in the hallway. He immediately recognized Michael's voice, but there were others with him. Richard pressed his ear to the door and caught part of the conversation. "The documents are ready. We just need his signature on a few more contracts," said a voice he didn't recognize. "The problem is he's being more resistant than we expected. He still wants to be involved in everything," Michael replied. "Well, a blind man can't run a company of this size indefinitely. Sooner or later he'll have to accept reality," said a third voice, which Richard recognized as Andrew's. A cold fury rose in Richard's chest. They really were conspiring against him, using his supposed blindness as justification to take control of the company he had built with his own hands. "What about the family? Won't his wife and children suspect anything?" asked the first voice. "Jennifer is more concerned about his condition than the business. And the kids? Well, Kevin has already shown interest in making changes to the company. Emily is too young to understand," Michael replied. Richard could hardly believe what he was hearing. Kevin, his 28-year-old eldest son, was involved in the conspiracy. And what did they mean by "Jennifer is worried about his condition"? The meeting continued for another half hour, but Richard had heard enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Michael wasn't just stealing from the company. He was orchestrating a full takeover, involving others and possibly even members of Richard's own family. When the voices faded, Richard waited another hour before leaving the office. He arrived home with a heavy heart, knowing that in the coming days, he would have to keep pretending everything was normal while processing the magnitude of the betrayal he had uncovered. Jennifer was watching TV in the living room when he arrived. "How was your day, dear?" she asked, standing to help him. "Quiet." "Just a few meetings," Richard lied, hating every word. "Richard, I need to talk to you about something," Jennifer said, her tone unreadable. Richard's stomach tightened. Was it possible Jennifer was involved too? "Of course, dear. What is it?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "It's about Kevin. He came by today and was asking strange questions about the company, about your condition," Jennifer said hesitantly. "He wanted to know if the doctors had said anything about your ability to keep working." Richard clenched his fists. So Kevin really was involved. His own son was part of the conspiracy to take control of everything he had built. "What did you tell him?" Richard asked, carefully controlling his tone. "I said that was our business, not his. But Richard, I'm worried. Kevin has never shown this much interest in the family business before," Jennifer explained. Richard realized Jennifer wasn't part of the conspiracy. She was genuinely concerned and confused by their son's behavior. It relieved him, but also deepened his anguish. How could he protect Jennifer from all this without revealing the truth? "Don't worry about Kevin, dear. He's probably just trying to help," Richard lied, holding his wife's hand. That night, Richard barely slept again. Now he knew the conspiracy was far bigger than he had imagined. Michael, Kevin, Andrew, and possibly others were plotting against him. But he needed more information before acting. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, over the following weeks, Richard perfected his act as a blind man. He memorized every detail of the office, the house, and the places he frequented. He learned to move convincingly, touching walls and furniture as if he truly needed them to navigate. Mrs. Barbara became his perfect accomplice. She reported everything she observed and even began investigating on her own. She discovered that Michael had started a consulting firm just a few months before Richard's accident, a firm that had coincidentally secured several lucrative contracts from suppliers who worked with Richard's business group. "Dr. Richard, I found the documents for Mr. Michael's company," Mrs. Barbara whispered one afternoon when they were certain they were alone in the room. "It's called Thompson Business Consulting, and in the last 6 months it's received over $3 million in contracts." Richard felt a mix of sadness and anger. $3 million. Michael had stolen $3 million from him using a shell company to divert contracts and opportunities that should have belonged to the business group they had built together. "There's more, Doctor," Mrs. Barbara continued. "I got a copy of one of the supplier contracts. They're charging 20% more for the same services they used to provide us, and that 20% is going straight to Mr. Michael's company as a consulting fee." Richard shook his head, stunned by the sophistication of the scheme. Michael wasn't just an opportunistic thief. He had planned everything meticulously, creating a web of corruption to siphon money from the main company into his own pockets. "What about Kevin? Did you find anything about his involvement?" Richard asked. "I'm still looking into it, but yesterday I saw him talking to Mr. Michael in the parking lot. It seemed like a serious conversation," Mrs. Barbara reported. Richard knew he needed to uncover how deep Kevin's involvement went. It was unbearable to think his own son was actively part of the conspiracy, but all the signs were there. The opportunity to gather more information came a few days later, during Richard and Jennifer's wedding anniversary. Kevin and Emily came over for dinner, along with Michael and a few other close friends. Richard used the occasion to observe the interactions between Kevin and Michael. Pretending to struggle with finding his napkin, he dropped a few items on the table, forcing those around him to move and talk among themselves. "Kevin, can we talk after dinner?" he heard Michael whisper to his son. "Sure." "About that matter we discussed yesterday," Kevin replied quietly. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Kevin really was involved. His eldest son, the boy he'd raised and nurtured, was conspiring against him alongside his best friend. During dinner, Richard paid attention to every word, every tone, every silence. Emily, his 23-year-old daughter, seemed unaware of anything. She treated Richard with the same affection and ease as always, showing no signs of hiding anything. Jennifer was radiant, happy to have the family gathered at home. She chatted excitedly about the trip she'd planned for him once his vision improved. Every word from her was a dagger in Richard's heart, knowing he was lying to the people he loved most in the world. After dinner, while Jennifer showed old photos to Emily in the living room, Richard managed to position himself near the balcony where Kevin and Michael had stepped out to talk. "It has to be soon, Kevin. He's starting to ask questions about some contracts," Michael was saying. "I know, but it's not easy. He's my father, Michael. What if he finds out I'm involved in this?" Kevin replied, his voice filled with anguish. "Listen, your father built an empire, but he can't run it forever, especially now with his condition. We're just speeding up the inevitable," Michael argued. "And you're sure he doesn't suspect anything?" Kevin asked. "How could he? He can barely sign a document without help. Besides, he trusts me completely," Michael replied with a tone that made Richard feel sick. Richard had to step away from the balcony before his anger became visible. Michael's arrogance, Kevin's naivety, it was all eating away at his soul. But he knew he had to keep up appearances a little longer. He still didn't have enough proof to confront them legally. That night, after everyone had left, Richard stayed up late thinking about how to proceed. He needed documents, recordings, concrete evidence of the conspiracy. Just overhearing conversations wasn't enough. He needed proof that could hold up in court if necessary. The solution came through Mrs. Barbara. She suggested they discreetly install recording devices in Richard's office and Michael's. Since Richard supposedly couldn't see, it would be natural for him to need assistive technology in his workspace. "We can say they're voice recorders to help you remember appointments and meetings," Mrs. Barbara suggested. "No one will suspect." Richard approved the plan. Over the weekend, when the office was empty, Mrs. Barbara installed small digital recorders in strategic locations. They were modern, nearly undetectable devices that could record for hours and were voice-activated. The first recordings were eye-opening. Richard discovered the conspiracy was even bigger than he'd imagined. Besides Michael, Kevin, and Andrew Johnson, at least 3 others were involved: 2 department managers from the company and an external accountant. Their plan was to gradually take control of different aspects of the company, using Richard's supposed incapacity as legal justification. They had researched legal precedents about businessmen who lost their faculties and were removed from their own companies for corporate responsibility reasons. "The idea is to make it look like a natural transition," Andrew explained in one recording. "Richard remains the nominal owner, but operational control shifts to more capable people." "And financially, how does that work?" asked a voice Richard recognized as Roberts, one of the managers. "There'll be a restructuring. New contracts, new partnerships. We'll all be properly compensated for the transition period," Michael replied. Richard realized they weren't just planning to steal money. They were restructuring the entire company for their own benefit. It was a corporate coup disguised as humanitarian concern. Over the following weeks, Richard collected hours of damning recordings. He uncovered specific details about offshore bank accounts, fraudulent contracts, and even plans to fire loyal employees and replace them with people aligned with the conspirators' interests. The most painful discovery was Kevin's true role in the conspiracy. His son wasn't just a reluctant participant, he had suggested some of the most aggressive strategies. In a particularly shocking recording, Kevin was talking about convincing Jennifer to sign a power of attorney that would give him decision-making authority over Richard's business affairs while he recovered. "My mother trusts me completely. If I say it's for his own good, she'll sign," Kevin said in a conversation with Michael. "Perfect. With the power of attorney, we can speed up the whole process. We won't have to pretend we're just helping Richard anymore," Michael replied. Richard had to pause the recording several times to control his emotions. Michael's betrayal was devastating, but Kevin's was unbearable. How could his own son be doing this? That's when he decided to include Emily in his plan. He needed someone in the family who could help him, and Emily had always been the more perceptive of his 2 children. Besides, from the recordings, he knew she wasn't involved in the conspiracy. Richard chose a Sunday afternoon to talk to Emily. Jennifer had gone out to visit a friend, and Kevin wasn't home. It was the perfect opportunity. "Emily, I need to talk to you about something very important," Richard said, asking her to sit beside him on the living room sofa. "Of course, Dad. What is it?" Emily asked, using the affectionate tone she always reserved for him. Richard took a deep breath and made the hardest decision of his life up to that point. He had to tell Emily the truth, even knowing it could forever change their family dynamic. "Emily, I'm not blind," he said, slowly removing his sunglasses and looking directly into his daughter's stunned eyes. Emily nearly fell off the sofa. Her eyes widened, and she brought a hand to her mouth in complete shock. "Dad, but how? Why?" she stammered, clearly struggling to process what she'd just seen and heard. Richard told her everything: the conversations he'd overheard, his suspicions about Michael, his plan to fake blindness, the discoveries of the past few months, and the painful revelation about Kevin's involvement. Emily listened in silence, her expressions shifting from shock to sadness, then anger and finally determination. "Dad, this is unbelievable. Michael, Kevin," she said, shaking her head. "What are we going to do?" "I need your help, sweetheart. I have recordings and documents, but I need more evidence before confronting them, and I need to protect your mother from all of this," Richard explained. "Of course, Dad. I'll help however I can. But, Kevin, really?" Emily still seemed unable to believe her brother's involvement. Unfortunately, yes. And that's why we have to be very careful. We don't know how far their influence goes, Richard said. From that day on, Emily became his secret ally. She was smart and discreet, qualities that proved essential in the events that followed. Emily began making her own observations, noticing details Richard couldn't see directly. It was Emily who discovered Jennifer was being psychologically manipulated. During casual conversations with her mother, she noticed Jennifer was being bombarded with concerns about Richard's ability to keep working. "Dad, Mum's been getting calls from Uncle Michael almost every day," Emily reported in private. "He keeps talking about how you need to accept help and the risks of continuing to work in your condition." "And what does your mother say?" Richard asked. "She defends you, but I can tell she's getting more and more worried. Yesterday she was crying on the phone with Grandma saying she didn't know what to do," Emily told him. Richard felt a mix of pride and sadness. Jennifer was being manipulated, yet she remained loyal to him. That made his decision to keep up the charade even harder, but also more necessary. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us out tremendously as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, the situation escalated when Kevin began pressuring Jennifer more directly. One Thursday evening, Richard was in his home office when he overheard Kevin talking to his mother in the kitchen. "Mom, you need to have a serious talk with Dad. He can't keep making major decisions for the company," Kevin said. "Kevin, your father is adjusting well. The doctors said his vision might still return," Jennifer replied. "But what if it doesn't? What if he makes a bad decision that hurts everyone, the employees, our family?" Kevin insisted. Richard clenched his fists. Kevin was using the exact same psychological manipulation tactics as Michael. "What are you suggesting?" Jennifer asked hesitantly. "Maybe it's time for him to step back. Let more capable people manage things while he recovers," Kevin said. "Kevin, how can you talk about your father like that?" Jennifer raised her voice, clearly shocked. "Mum, I'm saying this because I care about him. He's pushing himself too hard, trying to prove something he doesn't need to prove," Kevin argued. Richard had to restrain himself from storming into the kitchen and confronting his son right then. But he knew he had to wait for the right moment, when he had enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy at once. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, during a board meeting at the company. Richard had installed recording devices in the meeting room and planned the entire scenario with Mrs. Barbara and Emily. The meeting had been called by Michael, supposedly to discuss urgent operational matters. Richard knew it was a trap, but he decided it was time to turn the tables. All the conspirators were present: Michael, Kevin, Andrew Johnson, Robert, and 2 other managers. Also in attendance was Dr. Williams, Richard's trusted lawyer, who wasn't involved in the scheme. "Richard, thank you for coming. I know it hasn't been easy for you to attend these meetings," Michael began with feigned concern. "Of course, Michael. After all, I'm still the owner of the company," Richard replied with a smile no one could interpret behind his sunglasses. The meeting followed the script Richard had anticipated. Michael presented a temporary restructuring plan that essentially transferred all decision-making power to him and Kevin. Andrew explained the legal aspects that supposedly protected Richard from liability if anything went wrong with the company. "It's a temporary solution, just until you feel more confident resuming full responsibilities," Michael explained. Richard listened silently, pretending to consider the proposal. Inside, he was recording every word and analyzing every detail of their prepared argument. "Interesting," Richard finally said. "Have you already prepared all the necessary documents?" "Yes, they're right here," Andrew replied, placing a folder on the table. "We just need your signature in a few places." "Of course. Mrs. Barbara, could you read the documents for me?" Richard requested. Mrs. Barbara began reading the documents, and Richard pretended to follow along carefully. In reality, he already knew exactly what they contained. He'd hacked into Andrew's computer weeks earlier with the help of a trusted technician. The documents were even worse than he'd imagined. Not only did they transfer operational control, but they also included clauses that would make it nearly impossible for him to reverse decisions in the future. It was a sophisticated coup, disguised as legal protection, "I'll need a few days to think this over," Richard finally said. "Richard, the longer we wait, the more complicated the situation becomes," Michael pressured. "The suppliers are starting to question some recent decisions." Richard almost smiled. Of course the suppliers were questioning. They were likely being pressured by Michael to accept the overpriced new contracts that fed his shell company. "I understand the urgency, Michael, but this is a very important decision. I'm sure you all understand," Richard said, rising from his chair. After the meeting, Richard returned home with a heavy heart. He knew the net was closing in and that soon he'd be forced to make a choice. Either he revealed the truth and confronted the conspirators, or he kept pretending and risked losing control of the company. That evening, Jennifer noticed something was wrong. "Richard, you're very quiet today. Did the meeting not go well?" she asked, sitting beside him on the couch. "It was enlightening," Richard replied, choosing his words carefully. "Kevin called me earlier. He said you all discussed an important proposal," Jennifer continued. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. Kevin had called Jennifer. What had he told her? "Did he mention what we discussed?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. "He said it might be time for you to accept more help with the company, that it wouldn't diminish your importance at all. Just share the responsibilities," Jennifer explained. Richard realized Kevin was using Jennifer to pressure him into accepting the proposal. It was another layer of the psychological manipulation they'd been orchestrating for months. "What do you think about that, sweetheart?" Richard asked, genuinely curious about Jennifer's opinion. Jennifer was silent for a few moments before answering. "Richard, you've always been the strongest, smartest man I've known. If you think you can keep running the company, I trust you, but..." She hesitated. "But if you're pushing yourself out of pride, maybe Kevin and Michael have a point." Richard felt a sharp pang in his heart. Jennifer was genuinely worried about him, trying to balance her love and admiration for him with the doubts being planted by Kevin and Michael. "Thank you for being honest with me, sweetheart," Richard said, holding Jennifer's hand. "I'll think carefully about all of this." In the following days, the pressure grew significantly. Michael began visiting him daily, always with new urgent matters that supposedly needed immediate decisions. Kevin intensified his conversations with Jennifer, always emphasizing the risks of Richard continuing to work. It was during one of Michael's visits that Richard decided it was time to turn the tables. Michael had brought more documents for signing, including some contracts Richard knew were fraudulent. "Michael, I have a question about these contracts," Richard said, flipping through the papers as if trying to read them. "Of course, what do you want to know?" Michael replied, clearly confident. "These suppliers, Thompson Business Consulting, I don't recall approving contracts with them before," Richard said, watching Michael's reaction out of the corner of his eye. Michael hesitated for a split second before answering. "Oh yes, they're new partners, a specialized consulting firm that can help us with some technical matters," he explained. "Interesting. And how much does this consulting cost?" Richard asked, feigning innocent curiosity. "The amounts are within the normal budget. Nothing extraordinary," Michael replied, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Richard knew he'd touched a nerve. Michael was starting to realize Richard might not be as passive as he seemed. Of course. I trust your judgment," Richard said, signing the documents. But this time, Richard didn't sign his real name. He used a slightly altered signature, something that would look like a mistake from someone who couldn't see what they were writing. But in reality, it would legally invalidate the documents if needed. This small victory gave Richard the confidence he needed to plan his final move. He had gathered enough evidence, had compromising recordings, and now had documented attempts at fraud with his own forged signature. It was time to prepare the revelation that would change everything. Richard spent the weekend meticulously planning every detail of his revelation. He spoke at length with Emily and Mrs. Barbara, defining each of their roles and anticipating the possible reactions of the conspirators. "Dad, are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" asked Emily, concerned. "It's the only way to make sure none of them can escape," Richard explained. "If I confront Michael and Kevin privately, they could deny everything and still try to turn things against me." Richard had decided to make his revelation during the company's monthly expanded board meeting, which would take place the following Thursday. It would be a meeting with all the managers, directors, and some key investors. The presence of impartial witnesses would be crucial to validating everything he had uncovered. During the first 3 days of the week, Richard continued acting as usual, but he began planting seeds of doubt in the conspirators' minds. "Michael, I've been rethinking that restructuring proposal," Richard said on Tuesday. "I think you might be right about me needing more help." "Richard, I'm glad to hear that. I always knew you were a sensible man," Michael replied, clearly pleased. "Yes, but I have some conditions. I want to personally review all the contracts from the last 6 months before signing any transfer of responsibilities," Richard said. He discreetly watched as Michael's face paled slightly. Of course, but Richard, there are so many documents. Maybe it's better to focus on the main ones." Michael tried. "No, Michael. If I'm going to hand over control of the company, I want to be sure everything is in order. I'm sure you understand," Richard insisted. That night, Richard knew Michael would be desperate, probably making urgent calls to Andrew and the other conspirators. His recordings from the following days confirmed his suspicions. "He wants to review all the contracts," Michael said in a recorded call. "If he sees the Thompson Business Consulting documents, he'll find out everything." "Calm down, Michael. A blind man can't effectively review documents. We can prepare edited versions," Andrew replied. "What if he asks someone he trusts to review them for him?" Michael pressed. "Then we'll have to speed up the timeline, convince him to sign the transfer before the review," Andrew said. Richard smiled as he listened to the recording. They were panicking, and that would make them more vulnerable to mistakes. On Wednesday, Kevin showed up at the house unexpectedly, clearly agitated. "Dad, I need to talk to you about tomorrow's meeting," Kevin said, sitting in the living room. "Of course, son. What about the meeting?" Richard asked, feigning innocence. "Michael told me you want to review all the contracts before accepting the restructuring proposal," Kevin said. "That could delay the process, and some investors are getting nervous about the situation." Richard realized Kevin was using the same psychological pressure tactics as Michael. "Which investors, Kevin?" Richard asked. "Well, some of the main business partners. They're worried about the stability of the company's leadership," Kevin explained vaguely. "I see. And you think I should sign the transfer without reviewing the documents?" asked Richard. Kevin hesitated before answering. "Dad, you trust Michael, don't you? And me? Why can't you trust our judgment on these technical details?" said Kevin. Richard felt a mix of sadness and disappointment. Kevin was trying to use Richard's paternal love against him, manipulating family trust to further the conspiracy. "Of course I trust you, son. But as a businessman, I've learned that I should always verify important details," Richard replied. Kevin left the house clearly frustrated, and Richard knew it would be a night of urgent conversations among all the conspirators. On Thursday morning, Richard woke up early and meticulously prepared for the most important day of the last 3 years. He put on his sunglasses for the last time, knowing that in a few hours he'd be looking directly into the eyes of everyone who had tried to betray him. Mrs. Barbara arrived early at the office to set up the audio and video equipment that would record the entire revelation. Emily was positioned in an adjacent room, ready to witness everything that would happen. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. When Richard arrived at the office, he sensed tension in the air. Michael was visibly nervous, Kevin seemed anxious, and the other conspirators avoided prolonged conversations. "Richard, glad you're here early," said Michael, trying to sound casual. "Did you get a chance to think about our conversation yesterday?" "Yes, Michael. In fact, I have some news to share at the meeting," Richard replied with an enigmatic smile. At exactly 2 o'clock, the meeting room was packed. Besides the conspirators, the company's top managers, some external investors, and Dr. Williams, Richard's trusted lawyer, were present. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began, standing up from his chair. "Thank you for coming. I know some of you are concerned about the company's direction given my current situation." He paused, discreetly observing the expressions in the room. "Over the last 3 years, I've learned a lot about leadership, trust, and who truly cares about this company's well-being," Richard continued. Michael was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly sensing something was wrong. "Michael, my dear friend and partner, has prepared a restructuring proposal that, according to him, would help me manage the company better during my recovery," Richard said, looking toward Michael. That's right, Richard. It's a proposal designed for your well-being and the company's, Michael interrupted. Of course, of course. And I'm sure you dedicated a lot of time and effort to prepare this proposal. Just as you dedicated time to setting up Thompson Business Consulting, Richard said, noticing how Michael froze in his seat. A murmur spread through the room. Most people present weren't aware of this company. Richard, I don't understand. Michael began, but his voice was noticeably shaky. Thompson Business Consulting, Michael. The company you founded 8 months ago, which coincidentally has been receiving very lucrative contracts from suppliers working with us, Richard explained calmly. The silence in the room was deafening. Kevin was pale, Andrew looked ready to bolt, and the other conspirators avoided eye contact with anyone. Richard, I think there's a misunderstanding, Michael tried. There's no misunderstanding, Michael, Richard said, and then he did something that shocked the entire room. Slowly, Richard removed his sunglasses and looked directly at Michael with eyes that could see perfectly. The shock was instant. Several people gasped. Mrs. Barbara convincingly pretended to faint, and Kevin literally fell out of his chair. As you can see, said Richard, now speaking directly to the entire room, I never lost my vision. The last 3 years were an investigation to uncover who was truly loyal to this company and who was trying to take advantage of what they believed was my vulnerability. Michael was in total shock, his mouth open but unable to form words. Over these 3 years, I gathered extensive evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to seize illegal control of this company, Richard continued. I have recordings of conversations, falsified documents, and proof of fraudulent financial transfers. Richard walked to a projection screen and began displaying documents and playing excerpts of recordings that incriminated each of the conspirators. Michael Thompson, my partner of 20 years, embezzled over $4 million through fraudulent contracts with his shell company, Richard announced. Kevin Wilson, my own son, actively participated in the conspiracy, planning to use psychological manipulation against his own mother to obtain legal power of attorney, he went on, his voice cracking slightly when mentioning Kevin. Andrew Johnson prepared fraudulent legal documents intended to permanently remove me from the company I built, Richard said, pointing at the lawyer. The evidence was irrefutable. Clear voice recordings, signed documents, traceable bank transfers. Richard had built an airtight case against all the conspirators. Kevin finally managed to speak, but his voice was broken. Dad, it wasn't supposed to be like this, he stammered. Wasn't supposed to be like what, Kevin? Wasn't I supposed to find out? Or weren't you supposed to betray your own father? Richard replied with a mix of sadness and anger. Michael tried one last desperate move. Richard, you're sick. 3 years pretending to be blind. That's the behavior of an unstable person, he shouted. Michael, the only sickness here is the betrayal of people I trusted for decades, Richard answered calmly. Unfortunately, everything that happened here today is being recorded and witnessed by people of integrity. Dr. Williams stood up and began explaining the legal implications of everything that had been revealed. The evidence was enough for criminal and civil cases against everyone involved. Andrew tried to stand up to leave the room, but Richard stopped him. Andrew, I suggest you stay. I'm sure the authorities will want to speak with all of you very soon, Richard said. The meeting continued for 2 more hours as Richard systematically presented every aspect of the conspiracy. He had documented everything meticulously, building a case that would be impossible to challenge in court. When the meeting finally ended, the conspirators were escorted out of the building. Michael attempted one last personal appeal. Richard, doesn't our 20-year friendship mean anything? He asked, tears in his eyes. It meant everything, Michael. That's why your betrayal hurts so much, Richard replied. You didn't just steal money. You destroyed 2 decades of trust and friendship. Kevin approached Richard before leaving. Dad, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to come to this, he said, clearly devastated. Kevin, you're my son and always will be. But your choices have consequences. And you chose to conspire against your own family, Richard answered. That night, Richard arrived home emotionally exhausted. Jennifer was waiting for him in the living room, clearly aware something extraordinary had happened. Richard? She said, seeing him walk in without his sunglasses. Hi, love. Richard said, looking directly at her. "I have so much to tell you." Richard spent the next few hours telling Jennifer everything. The initial discovery of the conspiracy, the decision to feign ignorance, the 3 years of investigation, and the dramatic revelation that day. Jennifer had gone through every possible emotion: shock, anger, sadness, and finally a mix of admiration and worry. "Richard, I can't believe you spent 3 years lying to me," she said, tears in her eyes. "Jennifer, it was the hardest decision of my life. But if I had told you the truth, you might have unknowingly alerted Kevin or Michael," Richard explained. "And Kevin, our son?" Jennifer asked, her voice breaking. "Kevin made his choices, my love. He's an adult and must face the consequences," Richard replied, holding Jennifer's hands. Emily arrived home shortly after, and the family spent hours talking about everything that had happened and what would come next. In the following days, news of the revelation spread quickly through New York City's business world. Richard became both admired and questioned for his extreme strategy to uncover the truth. The legal consequences were severe for all conspirators. Michael faced criminal charges and had all his assets frozen. Andrew Johnson lost his license to practice law. Kevin was charged with conspiracy and fraud, though Richard intervened to secure him a lighter sentence in exchange for full cooperation with the investigations. The company underwent a complete restructuring. Richard promoted Mrs. Barbara to administrative director, recognizing her loyalty and competence. Emily took on a more active role in the business, showing a natural talent for leadership. As for the family, recovery was a long and painful process. Jennifer needed time to process 3 years of lies, however well-intentioned. Kevin, after completing his community service, spent years trying to regain his family's trust. 2 years after the revelation, Richard was in his office when he received an unexpected visit. Kevin walked in, visibly nervous but determined. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'd like a chance to talk," Kevin said. Richard looked at the son who had betrayed his trust, but also saw the boy he had raised and loved. "Sit down, Kevin," Richard said. Kevin explained how he had been manipulated by Michael from a young age, how small compromises had turned into full betrayal, and how the last 2 years of therapy and reflection had changed him deeply. "Dad, I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't think I deserve it. I'm asking for a chance to prove I've changed," Kevin said. Richard studied his son for several long minutes before responding. "Kevin, trust is like glass. Once broken, it can be repaired, but it's never exactly the same as before," Richard said. "But if you're willing to work hard to rebuild that trust, I'm willing to give you that chance." Kevin started at the lowest level of the company, working as an administrative assistant and proving his worth day by day. It was a humbling process for someone who had once been designated as the successor, but he accepted every challenge as an opportunity for redemption. Emily, who had initially resisted her brother's return, gradually began to acknowledge his genuine changes. Jennifer, always the family peacemaker, helped mediate the tensions as everyone learned to live with the scars of the past. Michael never fully recovered from his downfall. He lost not only his fortune but also his reputation in the business world. Occasionally, Richard heard updates about him through mutual acquaintances, but they never spoke directly again. 5 years after the revelation, Richard decided it was time for a true retirement. He called a meeting with the family and the company's top executives to announce his decision. "After everything we've been through, I've learned that life is too short to hold grudges and too precious to waste on constant work," said Richard. He announced that Emily would take over as CEO with Kevin as Chief Operating Officer. Mrs. Barbara would remain as a special advisor, bringing her experience and wisdom to important decisions. "Dad, are you sure I can do this?" asked Emily, clearly honored but nervous about the responsibility. "Emily, you've proven over the last few years that you have not just the technical skills, but also the moral integrity needed to lead," Richard replied. "What about me, Dad?" Kevin asked hesitantly. "Kevin, you've shown you can change and grow from your mistakes. That's a rare and valuable quality in a leader," Richard said. The transition was smooth. Richard remained available as a consultant, but gradually stepped back from daily operations. He spent more time with Jennifer, traveling and rediscovering hobbies he'd abandoned during decades of intense work. One afternoon, while walking on the beach in the Hamptons with Jennifer, she asked a question that surprised him. "Richard, do you regret pretending to be blind for 3 years?" Richard thought carefully before answering. "Jennifer, it was one of the hardest and most revealing experiences of my life. I found out who the people around me really were, but I also learned a lot about myself," he said. "What did you learn about yourself?" Jennifer asked. "I realized I'd become so focused on work and success that I'd stopped truly seeing the people I loved. The irony is that pretending to be blind taught me how to really see," Richard explained. Jennifer smiled and took his hand. "And what do you see now?" she asked. Richard looked at the woman who had stood by him through the toughest times, at the ocean stretching to the horizon, and at the future that finally seemed bright again. "I see a second chance to get things right," he replied. Years later, Richard's story became a case study in business schools, debated for both its effectiveness and its ethical implications. Some considered him a strategic genius. Others questioned the extreme methods he'd used. Richard rarely gave interviews on the subject, preferring to keep the more personal details private. But occasionally, when asked about lessons learned, he offered a simple reflection. "The truth always finds a way to come out. The only choice we have is whether we want to be part of its revelation or its victims." The company thrived under Emily and Kevin's leadership, which brought a new culture of transparency and corporate ethics. They implemented strict policies against conflicts of interest and created secure channels for internal reporting. Mrs. Barbara, now 70, continued working by choice, saying the company was her second family. She often told stories about the craziest 3 years of her career to new employees, always emphasizing the importance of loyalty and integrity. Jennifer never fully forgave Richard for lying to her for 3 years, but she came to understand his motivations. They went through couples therapy and strengthened their relationship in ways they hadn't thought possible after decades of marriage. One December evening, 10 years after the revelation, Richard was at home preparing Christmas dinner when Emily arrived with special news. "Dad, Kevin and I have something to tell you," Emily said with a mysterious smile. "What is it?" Richard asked, wiping his hands on his apron. "We've decided to create a foundation in your name. The Richard Wilson Foundation for Business Ethics," Kevin announced. Richard stood in silence, clearly moved. "The foundation will offer courses on business ethics and support small business owners who demonstrate integrity in their work," explained Emily. "We want your legacy to be about doing the right thing, not just accumulating wealth," added Kevin. Richard hugged both his children, feeling a satisfaction he had never experienced, even during the most successful moments of his business career. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for showing me it was all worth it." That evening, during the Christmas dinner, Richard looked around the table at his family. Jennifer, Emily, Kevin, and now the grandchildren born in recent years. Everyone was there, united despite all the storms they had weathered. He thought of the 3 years he had spent pretending to be blind, the sacrifices he had made, the painful truths he had uncovered, and the reconciliations that followed. "Dad, a toast," suggested Emily, raising her wineglass. Richard stood and looked at each person at the table. "A toast to vision," he said. "Not just the ability to see with our eyes, but the wisdom to see with our hearts. To the courage to face hard truths and the hope that it's always possible to start anew." "To vision," echoed the family, their voices blending into a harmony Richard would forever cherish in his memory. Later that night, Richard was alone in his home office, sorting through some old documents. He found a photo from 20 years ago, him and Michael on the day they inaugurated one of the company's first buildings. He stared at the photo for a long while, remembering how simple life had been when their only concern was constructing buildings and making money. Back then, he knew nothing about questionable loyalty, family betrayals, or the cost of misplaced trust. Jennifer walked into the office and saw the photo in his hands. "Does it still hurt?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," Richard admitted. "But it's no longer the pain of betrayal. It's the ache of nostalgia for an innocence I'll never have again." Is that necessarily a bad thing? Jennifer asked. Richard considered the question as he placed the photo back in the drawer. No, he finally said. Lost innocence has been replaced by hard-won wisdom. And wisdom, even when painful, is always a gift. He turned off the office light and walked with Jennifer to their bedroom, knowing tomorrow would be another day in a life that had become infinitely more complex, but also more authentic. Outside, New York City shimmered with its nighttime glow, a city where millions of people face their own daily battles between trust and suspicion, love and betrayal, between what seems to be and what truly is. And somewhere in that vast urban expanse, Richard Wilson slept in peace, a man who had discovered that sometimes you must pretend to be blind to truly learn how to see. The end of the story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Richard made the right choice by pretending to be blind for 3 years? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.